our next panel, the question is, how can a multi-chain Web3 impact businesses and communities? And for that, we have moderator Joon and Wong and Ignite CEO Peng Zhong to discuss this important issue.
Hey everyone! Thanks so much for joining us. I know it's 4 p.m. It's hot out there, and cocktails await. In fact, actually, there's a happy hour with Ignite at 5:30. If you want to chat with the Ignite team and Peng, definitely go to that. All right, so here we are. We're going to talk about a multi-chain world. Maybe let's start off with some high-level things. Why do we think a multi-chain world is needed? Like one of the taglines is like 1 million blockchains is possible, right?
Yep.
Is that a good thing?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I'm someone who comes from Web 2. I worked on web development and UI design, and I help many small businesses, medium businesses, enterprises, build and launch projects on the web. And these are all sovereign projects running on servers that they fully control, right? Or they pay for themselves. And these are scalable, right, to millions of users. They can be sharded into, data centers with tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users. Look at what's popular today, in Web 2. People use Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. And they have mastered scalability, right? And blockchain is nowhere near that. Web 3's inevitable conclusion is going to be, similar to Web 2 in terms of scalability, in terms of numbers of users, billions of users, right? And that's not going to happen on a single blockchain. It's not going to happen on 100 blockchains or even 1,000, right? We think, at Ignite, we think the upper bound for the number of chains in the world is the number of companies in the world. Any sort of enterprise that, happens in a group of people somewhere around the world in a country, right? They tend to create corporations for this purpose, right? And equity in a corporation is similar to your token allocation on a chain. And we think that with the proper steps in adoption, regulation support, and ensuring that we reach a standard that's globally acceptable, that's what we're going to see in the future, a world where most companies go on the chain, and even most organizations, informal ones, gaming clans, et cetera, might decide to track equity on chain.
So, let's unpack that, because I think there's a lot of implications, right? If you're in a world of millions and millions of chains, we've all been told like, oh, there's like the scaling trilemma, right? Like you can have speed, you can have security. I'm forgetting the third one. What's the third one? You can have...
it's like speed, security, scalability.
Decentralization.
Right.
The most important one, of course. If you have all these chains, like, I guess, what are the trade-offs? What are the trade-offs in this million chain world?
Yeah, so the trade-off in a million chain world is going to be interoperability, right? One of the huge advantages of a shared security platform, just take Ethereum, for example, is that, with every smart contract you deploy on something like Ethereum or a Solana, right, you do have access to all the other tokens that are on that same platform. It's relatively easy to access for users. It's relatively easy to navigate, all of the dApps that are on a particular chain. And with a multi-chain world, right, there is that trade-off. With the Cosmos ecosystem, which Ignite is a core part of, we've been working on the IBC protocol for many years. The idea of Cosmos came up in 2016, and we've been thinking about, how to scale to thousands and hundreds of thousands of chains for a very long time. So we think that IBC, is the right trade-off. It's a permissionless way for users, token holders on various chains that have IBC support to transfer them to other chains. There are over 50 chains that support IBC today. There are a number of chains also that support bridges to non-IBC ecosystems that are being developed for Polkadot, for Avalanche, for Bitcoin, for Ethereum. not just Ethereum, but for any EVM chain like Polygon, et cetera. So these all bridge into the IPC ecosystem. And you could argue that, the greatest web of interconnected blockchains is via IBC, because IBC, with its 50 chains connecting to all these other ecosystems, which also can connect to layer 2s and other scalability solutions, this is the Web 3 as it is today.
Well, maybe a good example of that in action is Terra, right? Which was a used IBC, had a catastrophic, let's say, failure, and all the other chains are fine, right? Am I?
That's right.
Is that the correct conclusion?
That's the correct conclusion. So, Terra used Cosmos technologies, it used the Cosmos SDK, and it had IBC supported, which did allow tokens on Terra, prominent ones like Luna and UST to flow across the IBC ecosystem. So I think it's untrue that, the ecosystem was not affected when Terra, its economic model proved to not function correctly. Especially projects that focus on DeFi and encourage or incentivize Luna or USD to travel those chains, they were heavily affected. In many cases, liquidity pools, right, didn't really have easy ways of halting themselves and allowing people to recover assets. So many of these liquidity pools were deeply affected, and the users of which were deeply affected. But at the same time, the damage was controlled, right, to a portion of chains that had interacted with Luna and UST. I don't think anyone expected the collapse of Terra, definitely not 99% of its users, right? So this is something that we have to work on as an ecosystem, right? In a multi-chain world, when you move an asset from one chain to the other, right, you're losing the security of it being on the base chain. For example, let's say another chain, like a coconut chain, right, is online. You take your coconut and take it to a DEX on a different chain, and then for some reason coconut goes offline forever, right? Then you have these coconut tokens that have no value on another chain because you can never redeem them back. You can never transfer them back to the home chain.
Well, maybe it's also worth unpacking a little bit the terminology, right? So we talk about multi-chain. There's also cross-chain, right? And I think Vitalik wrote about this maybe a few months ago. He thinks cross-chain transactions are quite difficult, problematic for security reasons. I guess what's your take on that, on the cross-chain versus multi-chain situation?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting conversation. I think there's a lot of particular nuance to this. In a lot of cases, at least when I talk to people in our ecosystem, those refer to the exact same thing. But if you're referring to the fact that cross-chain refers more to bridges, right, that are secured by multi-sigs, that's something that I'm hoping we're able to move away from, right? The reason why IBC was developed in the first place, for the Cosmos ecosystem is not just to allow Cosmos chains to interact with each other, but it's to create a standard that all chains could adopt, right? All chains that are that offer fast finality, which generally are most new chains today, including ETH 2.0, would be able to natively support IBC, which enables chains, or not chains, enables users of chains to directly send their tokens from one chain to the other without going through any sort of bridge, without relying on a multi-sig, without relying on questionable security, and it relies on the security of the chains themselves, the validator sets of these proof-of-stake chains, for example. And that's a much better and more decentralized model, right? We never want to see, $1 trillion on a bridge. That's secured by 8 people, or
Yeah.
8 addresses that might be controlled by a smaller number of people.
Yeah, and of course we've seen like many of the highest value and highest profile hacks of the last, let's say, 6 months have been precisely of these cross-chain bridges, right? I can think of, multi-$100 million hacks that have happened because of this. So your architecture avoids this problem, essentially.
That's right. Like I mentioned before, the trade-off in Cosmos is weighed heavily towards maximal decentralization, right? And our long-term vision is that the user experience of this will be improved such that people won't even recognize they're doing cross-chain transfers, but instead you can have interfaces that focus just on your assets across a variety of chains and a variety of ecosystems, And you just get this rounded up to this, your portfolio balance number. And that's what centralized exchange offer today, right? But they're entirely centralized. There is a way to do this while letting you custody all of your assets. And that's the future I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, talking about like UI and UX, right? So famously, your background is in design. So you were the first, I guess you were employee number 1 at Tendermint, which is now Ignite, and you were also the chief design officer. So tell us, I guess, a bit about how your design background actually informs some of the product decisions that you all have made.
Yeah, so my design background, deeply affects everything we do at Ignite. We have an incredible community in the Cosmos community, right, of these 50 plus interconnected chains and these tens of billions of dollars of value secured across these chains. We have, fantastic developers, some of the brightest in the industry who've been thinking about these scalability problems much longer than, last year, or when, people started thinking more about cross-chain bridges. IBC was, the right trade-off to make to enable this Internet of Blockchains to exist. But from the designer point of view, right, it's a long way off from an actual Internet of Blockchains, right? 50 chains, you can see it, on one slide of one deck. You can actually probably read every single chain name, see their logos, right? But then you look at, the modern representation, visual representation of the Internet, right? You can't see any individual node. There's, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of websites around the world. And this was only possible because, early on in Web 2, the creators decided to focus on developer experience, right? Decided to focus on tooling that was, allowed to fail, that was allowed, for example, HTML was allowed to render even if it was written incorrectly, It built on top of each other, right? Layers built on top of each other. In fact, like a plain text file can be represented on the internet, but then you can add, some basic HTML, you can add a tiny bit of CSS, you can load a GIF, Many of you probably, know some basics of developing a website, but the barrier to entry to Web3 is much, much higher. And, I argue that the focus on smart contracts today is fantastic, but it's only the beginning, right? It's similar to, writing, let's say, Java applets and hosting them somewhere on a website, right? That's not where the web is today. The web is here today because, teams, developers, it could be one person, it could be much more. They're able to build their own sovereign web application from the ground up, choose every bit of the infrastructure that they want. And at the same time, right, hobbyists were able to, build simple websites for their, their favorite hobby, whether it be flowers or cats. This is all what enabled people to build things of greater value.
Yeah, I guess that's the difficulty with kind of, let's say deploying a smart contract or even trying to spin up your own chain or issuing your own token is kind of like there's a complex interlocking number of issues, right? There's regulatory, there's security issues, there's the actual UI and so on. So, what are some ways, I guess, that people can get involved in that kind of thing, let's say in the Ignite or in the Cosmos ecosystem?
Yeah, so, I really like, the developer tools that exist around the Web 2 ecosystem. I use them to my advantage, all of these great open source tools that, I've contributed to, that I've used, that have helped other people understand to use, that I've hired people to use, right? And I want to create this great developer experience in Web 3 as well. So, in the Cosmos ecosystem, all of these IBC connected chains are built on the Cosmos SDK. But the Cosmos SDK is difficult to use. So what we've been working on Ignite over the past 2 years is a tool that makes building a sovereign blockchain as easy as launching a website. So these are pretty lofty words, and we're not all the way there yet, right? We're still heavily in development. But the idea is, you can go out today, use a web framework, and develop a website relatively easily, and find one of many hosting providers out there on the internet to host your website. And, there's many different bits of infrastructure available online to help you automate this or the other thing, whether it's like user accounts or, storing, lots of data. And, a lot of these tools are also available in Web3. But, as far as launching a sovereign chain goes, I think most people think of it right now as something just for large, well-funded teams, for enterprise. And we're working on changing that narrative with a tool like the Ignite CLI. It comes with a lot of batteries included, right? We understand it is more complex than Web 2. It is more complex than smart contracts. But with the CLI, you're able to scaffold a blockchain that includes a wallet, your own personal wallet that you're able to host anywhere online, and it lets you run it within a couple minutes and one command. And when you're ready to get it out there into the world, right, in a testing format, which most web developers are familiar with, hosting on maybe a subdomain somewhere or something along those lines, right? You're able to do so with another tool that we're building right now. It's a launchpad tool, and that's designed for helping people launch test nets and main nets into the future by connecting them to security providers, to hosting infrastructure.
So as of right now, can someone use the Ignite CLI to roll their own chain, or is that's something that's coming?
Yeah, so people can use Ignite CLI right now to roll their own chain. In fact, it's been used by many projects. Last I checked, there's at least 11 projects actively using Ignite CLI, including Umi and Juno, which are fairly large and valuable chains in the Cosmos ecosystem. They found value in scaffolding a lot of their chain with this tool. The one part of the tool that doesn't exist yet, that we're working on right now, is the part where you have to go out there and talk to individual proof of stake validators, get them on board. To run a decentralized network, you do need validators. If you only have one validator, right, that's most similar to Web 2, where you just have one web server, but that's not to the ethos of Web 3. So you do have to go out there right now and manually choose your validators. I think rule of thumb right now is you want at least 10, probably 20 validators, and that is a huge business development effort, right? Validators are generally overworked. There are many new chains coming into existence, in the greater crypto ecosystem, and every validator has to pick and choose very carefully, which chain they validate for. So it can be hard to get to this critical mass and actually launch your chain. So the Launchpad product, as I was talking about earlier, takes that work and makes that a lot easier. You can think of it as sort of like an Uber for validators, right? But instead of calling for one car to drive you somewhere, you're issuing a call for hundreds of validators to come check out your chain and to validate for your chain. And with a standard API, it allows validators to even automate their support for your chain, right? It can be sort of set and forget, and it'll make the experience much more similar to just going out to a hosting provider for a Web 2 project and hosting your project.
Oh, super interesting. And is there a date in mind for when that is going to launch?
Yeah, so we're targeting late 2022.
Okay, yeah, so later this year.
Later this year.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, you heard it here first, folks. And what about if let's say I have a project in mind, I'm ready to go. Is there some kind of funding process or grants process that I know many ecosystems have that you recommend?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways to get funding in Web3, but especially for solo developers and small teams, which I'm definitely fond of because I was there. It can be hard to even know who to talk to get access to these resources. So one of the other products we offer is the Ignite Accelerator, right? We're trying to set up our first cohort in starting October of this year, right? And we have 11 capital partners providing up to $150 million in funding over the course of the next 2 years, and us supporting 4 cohorts of chains that are looking for some level of support, be it business development, strategy, tokenomics, entity formation, like do you want to have a foundation in a jurisdiction outside of the U.S., for example? These are things that we're able to help with as well.
Gotcha. And maybe finally, we have about a minute left. I think one trend that I've seen kicking around a lot in this kind of cross and multi-chain space is sort of the idea of layer 0 or modular blockchains like our friends at XLR do. Mm-hmm. Do you see the same trend? What's the name? I guess, what's the term that you use to refer to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, at Cosmos, we don't really think of a layer 0 or of modular blockchains because, we're firmly in the camp that sovereignty is good, and we want to keep people, and communities fully in control of whatever they want to do, right? And whenever you introduce a layer that combines a lot of that, right, then you end up in situations where, you may be taxed without representation, right? You might not have the underlying governance token, for example, that supports all of these networks that connect together. So what I'd really prefer, right, is in fact not to have these things like layer zeros or multiple chains that are built on top of any single consensus layer, but instead to have UIs, multiple UIs in fact, and multiple ways of accessing all of these products together using the same underlying protocol, right? You can think of them like as different web browsers today, right? They all use HTTP. They all show mostly similar version of the web, but you're in fact able to use whichever platform you want.
Gotcha. I mean, I think that brings us back full circle. It's back to, I think, the importance of design and UI and UX. Peng, thanks so much for that conversation. We're out of time. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Joon.